Hello, neighbor. Just felt I needed to say that this morning. We are in the second week of this series that we're entitling Your Neighborhood. Last week we began the conversation of what it looks like to be a good neighbor. But I'm curious, and please don't raise your hand, especially if somebody could see that hand and know that hand in this audience today. But have you ever had a bad neighbor? Keep the hands down, okay? Have you ever had a bad neighbor? There was a pretty high-profile case in Southern California this last year involving two neighbors, a glass sculpture, and a TV theme song from the 1960s. Anybody hear that story? Okay, so this is how it went down. Neighbor 1 installed this glass sculpture on his property, but very close to the property line of neighbor 2. Neighbor 2 was okay with this glass sculpture, although it was not his taste, until neighbor 1 put up a soccer net around it to make sure that the limbs falling from trees did not break his glass sculpture. Neighbor 2 talked with neighbor 1 about this and asked him to take the net down at least. Neighbor 1 was not interested in taking the net down, so neighbor 2 took it to the city, and the city told neighbor 1 to take the net down. That's when things got fun. Suddenly, that weekend, from the house of neighbor 1 came a looping song of Gilligan's Island. The theme song to Gilligan's Island, right? Started looping nonstop day and night on loudspeakers outside the home. Neighbor 2 thought he was being harassed. Neighbor 1 told the court, "I just really like that song a lot." The courts decided that indeed neighbor 1 was harassing neighbor 2, and last I heard, neighbor 2 and neighbor 1 are continuing to file additional lawsuits against one another, and the feud continues. You ever had a neighbor like that? I hope you have never had a neighbor like that. I hope that you've never been in a feud like that. I hope that you have good neighbors and that you are a good neighbor. You know, even though it sounds like Jesus didn't have a house of his own and maybe not a next door neighbor because the Son of Man had no place to lay his head, right? The scriptures say. Jesus was this awesome neighbor. It's like he found everybody to be his next door neighbor and was a good neighbor to them. What makes a good neighbor? This question was once asked to Jesus, the best neighbor. And he responded with a story. But let's look at this story of when he was asked. This is from Luke chapter 10, beginning in verse 25. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" "What is written in the law?" he replied. "How do you read it?" He answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind. And love your neighbor as yourself." "You've answered correctly," Jesus replied. "Do this and you will live." But the expert in the law wanted to justify himself. So he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" You know, we all want eternal life. I mean, it really beats the alternative of eternal death, doesn't it? But few, it seems, are willing to change their ways in order to find eternal life. Rather than changing our actions, we are more prone to justify our actions. He wanted to justify himself. So he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Even if he was trying to justify himself, it's a great question. And the story that follows has become the most popular of all stories that answers this very important question: who is my neighbor? Here's the story. In reply, Jesus said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. Then Jesus asked the question, which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? And it's pretty obvious from the story, right? The expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. And Jesus told him, go and do likewise. We know the story as the story of the Good Samaritan. But while it's just a parable, and you know what a parable is, it's a made-up story to make a point, right? While it's just a parable, we can definitely see that this Samaritan that Jesus describes in the story is the likeness of Jesus. This is the way that Jesus spent every day of his life. How is that particularly? First, we can say this. Jesus had a heart for broken people. That's true, isn't it? How often do we see Jesus spending time with people whom others have already cast aside? He was known as a friend of tax collectors and sinners, and that wasn't really a compliment when it was said by most people. He called the riffraff of society to be his disciples. He touched lepers. He isn't scared away by creepy, demon-possessed people. It seems to be the very opposite of that. He's seeking them out. He's always on the lookout for a new neighbor. Not someone to be a neighbor to him, but someone he can be a neighbor to. How many of us, honestly, wake up every day with the prayer, God, I want a new friend. And the more broken and needy and creepy they are, the better. You like that? No, me either. I think Jesus was that way, though. I seriously think he was that way. There were 3 people who saw the man on the road. 2 of them wished that they hadn't seen him on the road, right? I wish I wouldn't have seen that, right? I accidentally locked eyes with him or something like that. Only one saw him and was broken by the brokenness. And rather than avoiding the broken, the Samaritan, and Jesus is this way, sought them out. Jesus has a heart for broken people. Secondly, we see this. Jesus lived for the interruptions. Being a good neighbor takes time. And the more time I give to others, the less time I have for myself. I don't know about you, but I struggle with that. I get distracted easily. Do you get distracted easily? And I don't like the distractions. When I have a mission in mind, I want to get that done. I want to just stay on focus, on track, and get that done. When I have something in mind to get done, don't get in my way. I don't necessarily like that about myself, but I know that about myself. Have you ever just sat down for dinner and the phone call ring or the phone rings, you answer it, and it's somebody who needs your help, and you're like, I was really looking forward to this steak or macaroni and cheese or whatever it is, right? Where do you think the Samaritan was heading this day? I wonder what plans were put on hold so that he could take care of this Jew for the rest of the day and night. I wonder what he had to put on hold financially because he gave 2 days' wages to the innkeeper to take care of him. How often do we see people and their needs as an interruption? Matthew 9 gives us a sampling of a day that I think was normal life for Jesus. In Matthew 9, we see that he's teaching with this crowd of people. And while he's teaching, John the Baptist's disciples come to Jesus and they have a question for him. And so they offer this question and Jesus, breaks away from his regular teaching to answer this question. It's an interruption, but that's what Jesus does. But the Bible says that while he is speaking, he's interrupted again. The interruption is interrupted. There's a man who comes and kneels before Jesus and he says, Jesus, I need your help. My daughter just died. And so Jesus takes the interruption to the interruption and starts following this man to his house. And what happens? He's interrupted again. Right? You remember the story. There's a woman who's in the crowd who reaches out and touches his cloak. And if you read the story, you find that needy people can sometimes drain us. But Jesus stopped and helped the woman. The interruption to the interruption to the interruption. That just seems to be his ministry. He just moved from interruption to interruption to interruption. He didn't get anything done because of all the distractions. Distractions are death to the mission, right? Jesus never accomplished his mission because of all the distractions. Wrong, right? See, it is true that the distractions are death to the mission, but it's really important that we clarify which is which. If we believe our mission is to make money, to stay safe, to build our kingdom on earth, and to keep ourselves free from pain, then when anything comes along that doesn't help us in that mission, like seeing a broken person along the path of our lives, we see it as a distraction. But clearly, building our kingdom on earth is not the mission Christ gives us, is it? If we're honest, if our mission is to love God and love neighbor, then all that stuff that most live for is not the mission, it's the distraction. People are the mission. And even good church people, like a priest and a Levite, can get the two confused. We don't see that in the Samaritan, nor do we see it in Jesus. Jesus is always taking time for the interruptions because the people that others saw as distractions, he saw as neighbors. And that was his mission, to love the Father and to love his neighbor. What about us? Is loving our neighbor a distraction to our mission? Or do we see loving others as our mission and everything else as a distraction? Maybe you have felt like you have not had a mission in life. You sure do. It's this: love your neighbor like crazy. And what we see in this story really is loving a neighbor like crazy. Twice this last week, I found it ironic that I'm preaching on this, and twice this last week, someone has called me for a ride. And I paused what I was doing, and I helped these friends get the rides that they needed. That's being neighborly. But it's not the extent of neighborly that Jesus is talking about in this passage. Jesus didn't tell this story to offer an example of what an act of kindness looks like to our friend or even to a stranger. What we see in the Samaritan is what we see in Jesus, and it's this. Jesus loved those who hated him. We miss a very important piece of the story if we don't know the history between the Samaritans and the Jews. Most of us maybe know a little bit of that. Let's just review it. The Jews hated the Samaritans. Why? The feud had been going on for about 1,000 years. It kind of started but they were all one nation, remember? And David was the king of Israel, and David was a good king. But it didn't last long that they were all one nation under one king. But God had promised, if you, David, do what's right and your descendants, you will never cease to have someone on the throne of Israel. There's David, there's Solomon, there's Rehoboam, split. And these people in the north versus those in the south, where Jerusalem was and the throne of David was. The people in the north, they started marrying foreigners. They became impure. They did not follow all of the laws of the Jews, of those in Jerusalem. They started worshiping other gods, and they built their own temples, and they claimed their throne in a city called Samaria. The Samaritans lived there. The north even took the name of the nation. How dare they? They take the name of Israel. We are Israel. We are David's descendants. We are the proper throne. The Jews hated the Samaritans. Even after both nations crumbled because of God's judgment and pagan people came and occupied their land, they would not bury the hatchet. They hated one another. And of all the people that Jesus would put in this story that he tells to a bunch of Jews, it's a Samaritan. Of the three who passed the man, you would expect the Samaritan to pass by on the other side. Or you might expect the Samaritan to walk up to the Jew who's laying on the side of the road and just kick him in the gut one more time. That's what you'd expect. But it's quite the opposite. The character who normally plays the villain in the stories of the Jews is the one who helps. He's the hero, the Samaritan. He helped the one who hated him. Who hates you? Earlier we spoke of feuding neighbors in Southern California. Well, Bob Goff is a neighbor from Southern California, but he's a good neighbor from Southern California. He's actually a Christian who practices law in California. I know some of you are saying, okay, a Christian lawyer from California can't be, But no, it's true, okay? He is a good neighbor. In fact, he teaches business at one of our Nazarene schools, Point Loma Nazarene University in San Diego. He has for several years had a heart for women and children who were being abused or trafficked, and has fought for justice in many awesome ways. A few years ago, a little boy, about 10 years old I think, who was abducted and assaulted by a witch doctor. This little boy, mutilated and left for dead in the bush of Uganda. Miraculously, though, he survived. And he walked home. And when Bob Goff became aware of the story, he said, I got to take that case. He knew that it would be difficult to convict the witch doctor, not because there wasn't proof, but because even though this pagan child sacrifice from witch doctors. It was common. The judges in that area were all terrified by the witch doctors, and none of them would try them in their courts. Miraculously, Bob Goff found a judge that would take the case in his court. And the witch doctor, named Kabi, was sentenced to prison. It was the very first conviction in Uganda's history against a witch doctor. It was big news. Justice had been served and it paved a way for more and more of these types of crimes to be tried and for criminals to be convicted. And of course, he felt very accomplished with this. But then something began nagging him. He couldn't help but wonder how Kabi was doing in prison. And so he called up the warden and he said, "Can I visit Kabi?" They didn't want him in there. But he did get in there. And he visited with Kabi. He had no idea how this evil witch doctor who was convicted of attempted murder would respond to the lawyer who had put him in prison. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he sure didn't expect what happened. Kabi entered that dark room where Bob waited. He came in without shoes on, with prison uniform that was dirty and torn. And when he came in, he knelt in front of Bob and told him how badly he felt for what he had done. At first, Bob was not convinced. You know, he's like, sure, he's not wanting to be here. He's sorry that he got caught, kind of thing. But Kabi went on to tell about how it was to be raised in a witch doctor's home himself, his father being a witch doctor, and how witchcraft had completely ruined his life. And then he said something that stunned Bob. He said these words, "I know I'm going to die in here. What I really need is forgiveness." Bob admits that his first reaction was to think, absolutely not. You tried to kill this little boy that I've grown to love. He had scarred this little boy for life. But he didn't respond that way because Jesus had begun changing him. That's exactly why he was in this prison talking with Kabi on this day. And so Bob shared forgiveness with him. Bob shared the gospel with Kabi. And Jesus began turning evil into love. A while later, Bob visited again. This time it wasn't in a dark meeting room, but in front of 3,000 other inmates. And Kabi was sharing with his fellow inmates what Jesus' love had done for him. Bob shares the story and he says he got the gospel all wrong. He mutilated the gospel. He didn't have a clue what he was talking about, but he was sharing love and what Jesus was doing in his life. And then he got out a water bottle and he started asking people if they wanted to be baptized. And he brought people up there and he started sprinkling water on them. And Bob was like, I don't think we can do that. I don't think we're allowed to do that. And Kabi just continued to do it. And after he had baptized these people that needed to come to Christ, Bob says that this face of this wounded man who is becoming love. This dark face with yellow eyes turned and looked at Bob. And with a voice that was strong and yet kind, said to Bob, "Bob, I forgive you." And Bob was like, "What?" Internally, he's thinking, "You can't forgive me. You're the bad guy. I have to forgive you. You can't forgive me." But again, God started working in Bob's heart. And he was recalling how Jesus said, you've got to love those who hate you. And realizing that Kabi really wanted to actualize that in his own life. If there was anybody that he could hate, it would be this one who brought him to prison. And he wanted Bob to know there's no hate. It could be that Bob really hated Kabi for what Kabi had done. And Kabi was recognizing, you may hate me, but I love you. Love does that in us. Jesus does that in us. That is what Jesus does. And it doesn't happen without Jesus. I started writing down the words of that song that we were singing, and somebody else is going to have to help me with the rest of this because I couldn't write down fast enough. The vilest offender who truly believes, how's it go? In that moment, a pardon receives. In that moment from Jesus, a pardon receives. Thank you, Joette. I knew we could get it if we had help from our friends. The vilest offender who truly believes, in that moment from Jesus, a pardon receives. Yes. Can we love like that? Who hates you? Jesus' way is to love your enemies. Bob still visits Uganda. And every time he is there, he visits Kabi, but he also visits the school that Bob founded. It's a witch doctor school. When I first heard that, I'm like, what? He said, we don't teach them how to practice witchcraft. They already know how to do that. He said, I asked the witch doctors, what is it that you need? How can I show love to someone who hates me? They said, we need to know how to read. So he said, we're going to teach you how to read. And you know what his curriculum is? The Bible and the book that Bob Goff wrote that's entitled Love Does. Yeah. And he tells these witch doctors, he said, I'm going to teach you to read. He said, but I'm going to tell you this. If you ever hurt a child like Kabi did, I'm going to put you in prison. And they're learning to love like Jesus. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. When we hated him, he sought us out. He denied any mission to help himself and offered us crazy love. He is the good neighbor. The Good Samaritan story was prompted by this wanting to justify one's actions. Who is my neighbor? Can I justify my actions? And Jesus could have saved some words and just said, well, everyone's your neighbor. But it's really easy to justify doing little for one because we're overwhelmed by the responsibility to neighbor all. So go ahead and love all. But if you start learning to love the one who hates you, you'll find it becomes natural to begin loving everyone. Who hates you? When I ask that question of myself, my first response is, nobody hates me. Everybody loves me. I love everybody. Everybody loves me. But I started to dig in this deeper. I don't think that's true. Who hates me simply because of where I live? They don't know me. They just know where I live. Who hates me because of my skin color? Right? Who hates me because of my economic status? And that could be poor, middle class, or wealthy. They're all hated by somebody from another class. You hear what I'm saying? Who hates you because of your religion or your morals or your values? Who hates you because you have made a decision that has caused somebody else pain? Who hates you? I think Jesus would be honored if we asked, who is the broken and the needy who hates me? How can I be a neighbor to them? Satan has one mission: to destroy people, to beat them up and to shame them and to get them to believe that God is against them. Jesus has one mission: to convince people of his love and to invite them into life with him. Jesus said it this way: the thief comes to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. And then Jesus went to the death for those who hated him. Jesus asked the lawyer that day, which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? This thief who wants to steal, kill, and destroy? The expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. Gave him what he didn't deserve. Jesus told him, go and do